Okay, so when we think about movies, I mean, it's almost impossible not to think about Hollywood, right? It's the global face of American film,
Mm,
a huge cultural force for, what, over a century now.
absolutely. It shaped so much of global entertainment, and, well, we all watch the movies, obviously. But you wanted to go deeper, really get into the hidden backstory, how the business itself changed so dramatically over time.
Yeah, and where it stands now, because there's all this talk about a crisis, an existential one even.
Exactly. And that's what our sources let us dig into today. We're aiming to track, the whole journey from these really quite humble, almost desperate beginnings back east.
Right, not even in California initially.
Not at all. Through that whole era of the big studios controlling everything, the studio
The
system.
golden age.
That's the one. And then right up to today's, frankly, pretty intense battle between what people call cinema, film as art, and this idea of content, just stuff to fill the streaming queue.
It's a huge arc. And you mentioned starting back east.
Yeah.
Let's kick off with that surprising fact you flagged. Hollywood wasn't always L.A.
Nope. Not even close initially. The very first commercial showing of a motion picture, that was actually New York City, way back in 1894, using Edison's kinetoscope.
Edison, okay, so he's central from the very beginning.
Oh, completely. And for a while, the capital of American filmmaking, if you can believe it, was Fort Lee, New Jersey.
New Jersey. Not quite as glamorous sounding, is it?
Doesn't have the same ring, no.
Huh.
But Edison's famous studio, the Black Maria, the first purpose-built movie studio, was in West Orange, New Jersey. And crucially, he owned the key patents.
The patents for the camera and the projector. The kinetoscope and kinetograph.
Yeah. He basically held the keys to the kingdom, technologically speaking.
Okay, so if the tech, the studios, everything starts in New Jersey, why on earth did everyone pack up and move 3,000 miles away to California? I mean, I know the weather's nice, but was it just sunshine?
The weather was definitely a factor. Year-round filming, reliable sun, that's a big plus compared to the East Coast winters. But honestly, that was secondary.
Secondary to what?
Escaping Thomas Edison. Or, more accurately, escaping his lawyers and his enforcement agents.
Enforcement agents. It sounds like the mob.
Well, maybe not that dramatic, but Edison formed something called the Motion Picture Patents Company, the MPPC, often just called the Trust. It was a consortium that pooled all the major patents.
So a monopoly, basically.
Pretty much. If you wanted to make a movie, legally, you had to license the equipment from the trust, pay hefty fees. If you didn't, or if you used rival equipment, they'd sue you. They'd send people to physically seize your cameras on set.
Wow. Okay, so making movies outside their system was incredibly risky.
Hugely risky. So filmmakers started looking for somewhere far away, somewhere the trust's agents couldn't easily reach them, somewhere less legally constrained.
So the Great Migration West wasn't really about chasing a dream of Hollywood glamour. It was about escaping a patent war.
Fundamentally, yes. Artistic freedom came later. The initial driver was economic survival and, frankly, avoiding litigation. Los Angeles offered that distance. It offered great weather, diverse landscapes, nearby mountains, deserts, ocean.
All good for different movie scenes.
Exactly. And maybe the clincher. It was only about 90 miles from the Mexican border.
A quick escape route.
Precisely. If word came that Edison's guys were on their way, you could literally pack up your cameras, head south, and be outside of U.S. jurisdiction pretty quickly. That geographical safety net was huge.
That's incredible. So that combination, distance, weather, locations, and the border escape hatch, that's what built Hollywood.
That's what cemented the move. Now, it wasn't instantaneous. D.W. Griffith shot a film called In Old California, actually in Hollywood, back in 1910. But the real consolidation, the point where L.A. became undeniably dominant, that was really solidified by the 1930s.
And that leads us right into what people call the Golden Age, or classical Hollywood cinema. Roughly, what, 1913 to the early 60s?
That's the general time frame, yeah. And this era was shaped by really two massive developments. First, the arrival of synchronized sound.
The Jazz Singer, 1927. The talkies arrived.
Changed everything overnight, practically. And second, the consolidation of the economic model that defined the era. The studio system.
Right, the studio system. We hear that term a lot.
Yeah.
What did it actually entail?
It meant total control. Think vertical integration on a massive scale. The big five studios, MGM, Paramount, RKO, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox.
The household names.
Exactly. They didn't just make the movies. They owned the production facilities, the giant studio lots, the cameras, the light. They owned the talent. Actors, directors, writers were under long-term exclusive contracts.
Like property, almost.
In a business sense, yes. And they owned the distribution networks, the system for getting the film prints physically shipped around the country. And crucially,
They own the movie theaters themselves.
bingo. Production, distribution, and exhibition. They controlled the entire chain, from the initial idea right down to the popcorn stand in your local cinema.
Owning the theaters seems like the ultimate power move. They could guarantee their own films got shown, right? Squeeze out competitors.
Absolutely. They used practices like block booking. If an independent theater owner wanted to show, say, the big new Clark Gable movie from MGM.
Which they obviously did.
Right. MGM could say, fine, you can have it, but you also have to take these 5 other B movies or shorts that we need to get rid of. The theater owner had no choice but to take the whole block.
So they forced theaters to show their lesser films just to get the hits.
Exactly. And blind bidding, where theaters had to bid on films often without even seeing them first, just based on the stars or the genre. It guaranteed revenue for the studios, regardless of quality sometimes.
And this system led to those really distinct studio styles we associate with the era, right? Like MGM's glossy musicals and dramas.
Yeah, MGM bragged about having more stars than there are in heaven. Warner Brothers became known for gritty gangster films and social dramas. Paramount had a more European, sophisticated flair sometimes. Each studio cultivated a brand.
But that much control. It wasn't just economic, was it? There was moral control, too. The Hays Code.
Ah, yes. The production code, usually called the Hays Code after Will H. Hays, who oversaw it. It was drafted in 1930, but the studios didn't take it that seriously at first.
What changed?
Pressure, primarily from religious groups like the Catholic Legion of Decency, who were horrified by some of the racier, more violent pre-code films of the early 30s. They threatened nationwide boycotts.
And boycotts mean lost money.
Big money. So starting in 1934, the studios agreed to give the Production Code Administration, run by Joseph Breen, real teeth. From then on, pretty much every film released by a major studio had to get a seal of approval.
And if you didn't?
If you dared to release a film without that seal, a massive fine, $25,000.
Doesn't sound huge today, maybe.
But in 1934, money. That $25,000 is equivalent to nearly $500,000 today.
Okay, wow. That's not a fine. That's a death sentence for a film's budget.
Exactly. It ensured near total compliance. The code dictated everything crime couldn't pay. Villains had to be punished. Explicit sex or violence was out. Even certain words were forbidden. It shaped the content of American movies for decades.
So you have this incredibly powerful, vertically integrated system controlling production, distribution, exhibition, and content through the code. It seems untouchable. What brought it down?
The government. Specifically, the Department of Justice. They saw this whole setup, especially the studios owning the theaters and block booking, as a clear violation of antitrust laws.
Like any other monopoly controlling a market unfairly.
Precisely. It culminated in a landmark Supreme Court case, United States v. Paramount Pictures, Inc. The decision came down in 1948.
And the verdict.
The court agreed with the government. They ruled that the studios owning the theaters and engaging in practices like block booking was an illegal restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act.
So what was the consequence? They had to sell the theaters.
That was the big one. The studios were forced to divest themselves of their theater chains. They had to choose. Either make and distribute movies or exhibit them. They couldn't do both anymore.
That must have completely shattered their business model.
Fundamentally.
Wow.
It broke the vertical integration. Suddenly, their guaranteed revenue stream from their own theaters was gone. They had to compete to get their films booked into theaters, including the ones they used to own.
And it also ended the old long-term contract system for stars.
It was a major blow to it, yeah. Without the guaranteed income from theaters, studios couldn't afford to keep massive stables of stars under exclusive contract quite the same way. Power started shifting towards the talent, towards agents. It led to the rise of independent production packages. A director, a star, a script coming together for one specific film rather than being assigned by the studio machine.
Interesting. So the antitrust case, by breaking the monopoly, actually opened the door for more creative freedom in a way.
It definitely changed the equation. Before 1948, studios could rely on volume and guaranteed exhibition. After 1948, each film became more of an individual gamble. They had to focus more on quality, on unique stories, on things that would actually draw audiences into competing theaters.
And you mentioned this earlier, this shift, this need to take risks on individual films is maybe what allowed some classics to get made, like Citizen Kane.
That's a fascinating point raised in the sources, yeah. Citizen Kane, although made before the final Paramount decision, was exactly the kind of risky, medium-budget, artistically ambitious film with a non-traditional structure that the old guaranteed revenue system wasn't really built for. RKO took a gamble on Orson Welles.
And it famously flopped initially, right?
It did. It lost money. But the post-Paramount environment, arguably, created more space for those kinds of necessary risks. Studios couldn't just churn out predictable programmers quite as easily. They had to occasionally bet on vision, on a good script, even with less established stars, because quality started to matter more in a competitive market.
So the collapse of the old system paves the way for what came next, New Hollywood.
Exactly. The late 60s and 70s saw the rise of New Hollywood. This was the era of the film school generation directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg.
The movie brats.
That's them. They grew up watching and studying the classics, they revered film history, but they also wanted to break the old molds. They brought a new energy, often a more personal or auteur-driven style.
And critically, they also learned how to make huge amounts of money.
Oh, absolutely. This era quickly transitioned into the age of the modern blockbuster, kicked off by things like Jaws in 75 and then Star Wars in 77. These films weren't just hits, they were cultural phenomena. They changed the scale of success, the marketing, the focus on sequels and franchises.
Bigger budgets, bigger spectacle, bigger audiences needed, which I guess pushed technological innovation too.
Definitely. As the blockbuster mentality took hold through the 80s and into the 90s, there was a constant push for bigger, better, louder experiences to justify the ticket price. That's where we see major leaps like digital sound.
Dolby Digital.
Right. Debuting widely with films like Batman Returns in 92, suddenly sound was clearer, more immersive. And then the really game-changing stuff. Computer-generated imagery, CGI.
Terminator 2 and the liquid metal T-1000.
Unforgettable, 1991. And then just 2 years later, Jurassic Park in 93. Seeing those dinosaurs, it felt like magic. It completely changed what was possible on screen. Spectacle became paramount.
So blockbusters, CGI, global audiences. This all leads us towards the current moment, doesn't it? And this tension you mentioned earlier between cinema and content.
It really sets the stage perfectly, because the drive for global spectacle, combined with huge technological shifts in distribution, namely the internet and streaming, has brought us to what many see as a crisis point.
The rise of Netflix, Disney Plus, carry Amazon Prime Video, HBO Max. They dominate how we watch things now.
And their business model is fundamentally different from the old studio or even the theatrical blockbuster model. They're not primarily selling individual movie tickets. They're selling subscriptions.
So they need a constant stream of stuff to keep people subscribed. Volume matters.
Volume, recognizable stars, easy-to-market concepts, existing intellectual property, IP. These things become incredibly valuable in a subscription world. And this trend, treating films primarily as content to fill a platform, well, it's drawing intense criticism from many traditional filmmakers.
Yeah, the quotes are pretty stark. Martin Scorsese, what did he say? Cinema is being
systematically devalued, sidelined, demeaned, and reduced to its lowest common denominator, content. He finds the relentless focus purely on box office or streaming metrics repulsive.
That's strong language from arguably America's greatest living director.
It is, and he's not alone. Quentin Tarantino has called the current era potentially one of the worst in Hollywood history in terms of the movies actually getting made and released theatrically.
Wow. Worst ever.
His opinion, but it reflects a deep frustration. And Charlie Kaufman, the writer of films like Being John Malkovich and Eternal Sunshine, he put it even more bluntly. He said, essentially, the only thing that makes money is garbage.
Ouch. Are they just being, resistant to change? Or is there something specific they're pointing to?
I think they're pointing to a shift in priorities driven by the economics. Look at some examples the sources mention. Red Notice, that big Netflix movie with Dwayne Johnson, Gal Gadot, Ryan Reynolds. Huge budget, around $200 million.
Huge stars.
Massive stars. And it got enormous viewing numbers on Netflix. But critics widely panned it. One described it as feeling like it was processed by a machine, like an algorithm assembled it from popular plot points and star appeal, rather than coming from any artistic vision.
But for Netflix, maybe the viewing hours justified the cost, regardless of critical reception.
That seems to be the logic, yes.
Yeah.
It served its purpose as high-profile content. Or take Space Jam. A New Legacy.
The sequel with LeBron James.
Right. Heavily criticized as basically just a giant commercial for Warner Brothers' intellectual property library, all jammed into one movie. A lengthy infomercial for HBO Max, one critic called it. IP for the sake of IP.
So the argument is that the pressure to create globally appealing, easily marketable content, often based on existing brands, is squeezing out riskier, more original, maybe more artistic films.
That's the core of the criticism. The financial incentive structure, especially in streaming but also influencing theatrical releases, seems to favor safe bets, sequels, remakes, adaptations of known IP over original stories or challenging dramas.
And this focus on global markets brings in other complications too, right? Like
Yeah.
issues of representation and, well, censorship.
Absolutely. Hollywood is global Hollywood now. The international box office is often more important than the domestic take for big blockbusters. This has huge implications.
We'll talk representation first. The celluloid ceiling, what are the numbers there?
Well, the data evolves, and there has been progress, let's be clear. But historically and sometimes persistently, the numbers aren't great. The sources cited a 2012 study, for instance.
Okay, a decade ago, but gives a baseline.
Right. In 2012, among the top 250 grossing films, only 9% of directors were women. Only 15% of writers were women. When certain voices are consistently underrepresented behind the camera, it inevitably impacts the kinds of stories being told and the perspectives being shown on camera.
And there's the pay gap issue too.
Yes, particularly noted for older actresses compared to their male counterparts. Even established female stars often face a significant disparity in pay compared to male stars of similar age and stature. It's a persistent equity issue.
Okay, so internal representation is one angle.
Yeah.
What about the external pressures from being global Hollywood? You mentioned censorship.
Yeah, this is a really complex area because Hollywood relies so heavily on access to international markets, especially massive ones like China. There's often immense pressure to shape the content of films to avoid offending foreign governments or cultural sensitivities.
So self-censorship, basically, to guarantee access.
It often operates that way, yes. It's a market access decision. The sources mention the historical example of studios in the 1930s downplaying or avoiding negative depictions of Nazis.
Seriously, even in the 30s.
Yes, because Germany was an important market, and they didn't want their films banned there. It's business calculation overriding other concerns.
And more recently, the focus has been on China.
China's become a huge factor. Its box office is massive. So there are documented cases where studios have altered films to appease Chinese censors. The example given was the remake of Red Dawn.
Right, the original was about Soviets invading. The remake.
The villains were initially written and filmed as Chinese, but during post-production, facing the potential loss of the entire Chinese market, the filmmakers digitally altered flags and symbols and redubbed dialogue to make the invaders North Korean instead.
Wow, just swapped out the antagonist to maintain market access.
It's a stark example of how global economic pressures can directly influence the creative content of a Hollywood film.
Okay, so we've covered the business evolution, the creative tensions, the global pressures. What about the actual people who make these movies? The labor force. It's not a typical 9-to-5 job.
Not at all. That's a crucial piece often overlooked. Hollywood runs on a project-based, freelance economy for most of its workforce. The crews, the writers, many actors, even directors often go from gig to gig.
Feast or famine, kinda.
Very much so. And the work itself can be incredibly demanding. The sources mention the potential for grueling hours, 16, 17-hour days, aren't unheard of, especially during intense periods of shooting on location. It's high-pressure, deadline-driven work.
Which makes the unions incredibly important, I imagine.
Absolutely essential. Because most workers aren't permanent employees of one studio, the unions provide the stability and the safety net. You have IATC for the crews, the grips, the electricians, the costumers, camera operators.
The backbone of the production.
Definitely. Then SAG-AFTRA for actors and broadcasters, the DGA for directors, and the WGA for writers. These major guilds and unions negotiate industry-wide contracts.
With who? Who do they negotiate with?
They bargain collectively with an organization called the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP, which represents the major studios and production companies.
And what do these contracts cover?
Minimum wages, working conditions, safety standards. Crucially, they also provide portable health insurance and pension plans, which is vital in a freelance industry where you're constantly changing employers.
And we saw how powerful these unions can be with the recent strikes, right? The writers and actors.
Exactly. Those strikes highlighted key modern issues. A big one was residuals getting fair payment when films and shows are rerun on streaming services, where the old payment models don't really fit.
Because the viewing data is often hidden by the streamers.
Precisely. And the other huge issue was the threat of artificial intelligence. Writers worried about AI being used to generate scripts, actors worried about their digital likenesses being used without consent or compensation. The unions fought for and won significant protections in those areas. It shows how collective bargaining is adapting to these new technological and economic challenges.
Okay, so wrapping this all together, it's quite a journey. Hollywood starts almost accidentally as a way to dodge patent lawyers.
Right, a legal refuge that happened to have good weather.
Then it builds this incredibly powerful monopolistic studio system that controls everything, even morality via the Hays Code.
Until the government steps in and breaks up that vertical integration with the Paramount Decree.
Which maybe unintentionally creates a space for more creative risk-taking, leading into new Hollywood and the blockbuster era.
Driven by spectacle, global markets, and huge technological leaps like CGI.
And that brings us to today. This battle between artistic cinema and platform-filling content, complicated by global politics, censorship pressures, and ongoing labor fights over things like streaming residuals and AI.
It's a confluence of crises, really. The old models are under strain, the new models prioritize different things, and the very definition of what a movie is or should be seems up for grabs.
So what's the final thought you want to leave us with, reflecting on all this?
Well, think back to that moment after the Paramount decision. That period where the collapse of the old certainties forced studios to diversify, to take chances on things like Citizen Kane, that medium budget feature with a good script and relatively unknown actors. It was a risk, but a necessary one in that competitive landscape.
Okay.
So the question for you listening now is this. In today's Hollywood, dominated by the hunt for global tentpoles, pre-existing IP, and streaming metrics, can the system still afford to take those kinds of risks? The medium-sized, original, maybe challenging film.
Is there room for another Citizen Kane today?
Oh.
Or does the economic pressure for guaranteed, brand-driven content just make that too dangerous a gamble?
Exactly. What kind of artistic risk is truly left or even valued in an industry increasingly driven by algorithms, franchises, and the need to feed the beast of perpetual streaming growth? Something to definitely mull over next time you're scrolling through your options.